Can you explain to us what is this 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development? Why is it important, and who would benefit from this?
First of all, we've been in the business of implementing the Millennium Development Goals as a global community through multilateral systems, including the United Nations in the world. And countries around the world, particularly countries, developing countries, have been caught up in this development challenge of implementing the Millennium Development Goals. So the Millennium Development Goals were themselves hugely important and ultimately successful in galvanizing the support, both financial, human, technocratic, and so on, that the world needed to try to tackle the worst forms of, if you will, underdevelopment. Child mortality, maternal mortality, illiteracy, aspects of poverty, the worst forms of extreme poverty. So in this regard, we have seen a huge success over the last 15 years. But there was still a lot that needed to be done. So that was the first challenge. The second challenge was that in the midst of the last 20, 30 odd years, it's become self-evident in the world, both in the developed and the developing world, that the consumption and production habits that we have now acquired have become detrimental to the planet in which we live, and have begun to create real existential threats for us as human beings. They are creating existential threat for the animals, for plants, for forests, for fisheries. And something had to be done and needs to be done to try to contain this. In the midst of all of this, we also recognized that there were effects to our climate that were happening as a consequence, particularly of our production habits. The greenhouse gases that we were pumping up in the air, the destruction of the forests, which sequester the greenhouse gases. All those things have come together in the last 15 odd years to make people realize that we really needed to do something differently, that business as usual simply could not continue to be the case. So we are now at the point where we have put together the Sustainable Development Goals that deal with issues that are similar to the Millennium Development Goals, but significantly different in their level of ambition. Okay? But at the same time, we've added all the other issues that need to be taken care of in the context of protecting the planet and in the context of ensuring prosperity for people. So issues of urbanization, industrialization, issues of biodiversity care, climate change, issues of peace. All these are things that are singularly important for us to have a planet that is at peace with itself, where people are living in peace, a planet that is enjoying prosperity, and a planet that is at the same time protecting its fundamental ecosystems and life systems that will keep us all alive and provide a better future, prospects for future generations.
And you mentioned here that peace is one of those components that was not in the MDGs, but is now a centerpiece in the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you speak about that intersection between development and peace, and why is it so relevant?
There is no peace truly without sustainable development. Okay, because a lot of the civil strife that we see out there, a lot of the conflict that we see out there is built around resources. Pastoralists, even at that level, trying to get pasture for their cattle and running into areas where other pastoralists are also trying to take care of their cattle, and you have these conflicts. It sounds very basic, but that in and of itself is a big problem in many parts of the world. Why? Because, first of all, population increase. Second of all, there is the land, and the pasture itself is becoming less and less because of the climatic conditions, droughts, and so on. Water scarcity, as pastoralists end up competing for scarce water resources. That is a very minute example of how, at the very local level, peace can be undermined by the lack of a common approach to how we manage development in a sustainable way. On a global level, we are seeing examples of where climatic conditions are creating an upheaval in the way in which societies are able to live with each other. And that in itself creates stresses in societies and between nations that in itself can undermine peace. So we see peace at local level and within the domestic sphere being undermined by the lack of proper approach to sustainable development, but we also see that between nations at the global and international levels. So at the end of the day, there is no peace without sustainable development, but we also recognize that there is no sustainable development without peace. And that in itself was what drove the impetus for putting together the Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals.
It is truly a new era for the UN and for sustainable development now that we have a much more comprehensive agenda in our hands. And how do you think that the SDGs and the 2030 agenda can be implemented in Africa?
First of all, this is a universal agenda.
Right.
It is an agenda for all of the world's nations. That's a unique and special aspect of the new development agenda. So it isn't a development agenda just for the continent of Africa or just for developing countries. Developed countries are going to have to engage and invest in special ways to ensure that they also attain all the 17 goals for sustainable development. And they are themselves seized of these issues. I mean, we've heard very prominent leaders in the last few days, from President Obama to Chancellor Merkel to the Prime Minister of France. All of them have spoken and welcomed the new agenda and the SDGs in the last few days. But we've also heard a chorus of response from developing countries who recognize that this is a step up from where they were before with the MDGs. So in the case of Africa, unquestionably, we are along a trajectory of development that allows us to focus on certain things in ways in which we can avoid making mistakes that have been made by much more developed countries. So our adaptation responses, for example, in the context of environment, is a huge opportunity for us. The way in which we exploit the resources, both energy and other kind of resources that we have, can ensure that we do not end up on the same destructive path that has been walked by the more developed countries in earlier years. The way in which we manage peace and social order, the way in which we manage urbanization, the way in which we engage and develop new infrastructure, because Africa is on a rapid trajectory right now on putting in the infrastructure that it needs for sustainable development. So there are these opportunities that are going to come up over the next few years that Africa has to seize and avoid making the mistakes that were made by developed countries.
Right, so that's one of the beauties of this new agenda, that is not only or tilted towards the South or developing countries, but it's a much more broader universal agenda that in a way developed countries will have to learn from the South that has been implemented the MDGs for 15 years. So you've managed to tilt the tables in a way by adopting such ambitious document. And lastly, we would like to ask you, how can people help implement this agenda? What would be your best suggestions or advice if someone wants to get involved in implementing the 2030 agenda?
Well, if you look at the agenda, the preamble of the agenda speaks to 5 categories, if you will. People, planet, prosperity, peace, and participation. All right? And there's a reason why we have that. The first 3 are the fundamental deliverables for sustainable development: people, planet, and prosperity. Without that, without embracing people, bringing people on board, making sure no one is left behind, whether we're talking about communities, whether we're talking about ethnic groups, indigenous people, every category, all people of all status have to be reached out to. This is a universal agenda, not just between countries, but within countries. So people have to be part of this. But it's also about protecting the planet, as it is about prosperity, because you cannot expect people to be engaged in an agenda that does not give them better prospects for a better future. So prosperity is fundamental. We can't have 2 billion people living on less than $1.5 a day.
Right.
It's just not sustainable. It's not a credible proposition for vast tracts of populations in the world. That has to be corrected. But participation is the key to all of this, because if people themselves don't change their consumption habits, for example, the way in which they use vehicles, the way in which they use air conditioning, the way in which they build homes, the way in which they consume food, the choices of foods that they pick to consume, the way in which they get rid of their waste, the chemicals that they use in their homes. If all these things don't change, particularly in the most sophisticated developed countries, then we will not attain our objectives. Individuals have to get engaged in this whole program in very special ways, making choices at home that will have consequences along the line of delivering sustainable development for the world.
Wow. So 2030 is a paradigm shift.
Absolutely, that's what it is. It represents a huge change, step change in the way in which we think development, the way in which we act development, and the way in which we realize development.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your time, and congratulations for this incredible gargantuan task. Kenya and you particularly should be proud, as all eyes are on this new plan for the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you.